So today we're really blessed and lucky to have three wonderful speakers with us. The first being Cole Kinney, who is the Senior Vice President of Development for CalNonprofits Insurance Services. We also have Colleen Lazanich, the CEO of CalNonprofits Insurance Services, and Ingrid Mittermaier, the principal at Adler Colvin. So welcome, everyone. We're so pleased to have you with us today. I'm looking forward to an engaging and informative webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all and let you take the floor.
Thanks, Robert. Really appreciate to be able to do this webinar together with Cole and Colleen. And we've really enjoyed working with Cole and others at Cal Nonprofit Insurance Services. So we provide a lot of our clients are nonprofits, and it's just been a wonderful experience to have Cole and his team as a resource to help with the important insurance needs of many of our clients. So I've really appreciated that and looking forward to doing this webinar together. So do either of you want to say a quick note on this slide before we go into the substance?
Just really happy to be here. I've been working with Adler Colvin for many years and have really seen them, as Ingrid says, be a trusted resource for us. So I'm really happy to be here doing this specific topic because we get so many questions on this. And I'm really happy that Ingrid is going to be able to provide a lot of good information about what fiscal sponsorship is. And then we can kind of talk, Colleen and I can talk to the insurance aspects of that.
And Cole summed it all up. So thank you for having us today.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So yeah, this is, I think, one more time, the information. This is the topic. Hope you're all at the webinar you thought you were signing up for. Fiscal sponsorship, essential do's and don'ts. This is the three of us. Let's go to the next slide. So as Cole mentioned, I'm going to spend the first part just on some really important legal and practical considerations of what fiscal sponsorship really means. And on some level, we're going to focus on the point of view of somebody, some entity that wants to act as a fiscal sponsor, wants to offer fiscal sponsorship. That's the organization. Then there are projects and individuals that might want to take advantage of a fiscal sponsorship arrangement that would work together with an organization. So it's helpful for all parties involved to sort of understand what it is, what a fiscal sponsor needs to do and is setting up, and how the project plugs in. So this is sort of a basic definition. What does it mean for an organization to become a fiscal sponsor? And really what we're talking about is an arrangement between an established 501c3 public charity that will act as the sponsor and a project entity or leader that want to be sponsored. And the basic arrangement is the sponsor determines that someone else's project will further its own mission. So it is going to be part of the organization's own mission. The sponsor, because it's already a public charity, has its IRS letter, receives tax-deductible donations qualifying for 170 deductions, can receive grants from private foundations, other funders. The sponsor receives those donations as restricted funds that it can only use for the charitable purposes of the project. And then it holds those funds and administers them in support of the project. And the sponsor very typically also provides other types of administrative support to help the project. Let's go to the next slide. So just a little bit more teasing out because there tends to be quite a bit of confusion as to what this is. So what is fiscal sponsorship? You can think of it as a tool. It's really just a practical construct that helps an existing 501c3 that maybe wants to broaden its reach. It's excited about other informal projects in the community that don't have their own 501c3 organization. It wants to nurture them. It wants to support them, and sort of it brings it under its fold. And it does that with an arrangement, with a contractual arrangement to let that project sort of go under its umbrella. we can think of it sponsorship in its classic words. If you think of sponsorship, it means helping somebody with funding, with support, with technical advice. So the organization is really taking on this project in different ways that it can define what exactly the support is to really support and nurture the project. This is not sort of a passive, sort of set it aside and forget about it relationship. This is not some terminology that can be confusing is this is not a fiscal agency or letting someone else use an existing organization's exempt status. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding. There's some individual or project out there. Well, I want to get some donations. I need to give somebody's tax ID, exemption number to get deductions. And then somehow the money just sort of passes through an existing 501c3 and the individual runs with their project. That is not what we're talking about for very many reasons. That is not a sound approach. And fiscal agency sort of implies that the sponsor is a very passive agent that simply passes money through to a project without exercising further oversight. So that is not what we're talking about. Why does it matter? I think there's two important reasons. There's many reasons, but two reasons maybe we can highlight here. One is that for donors, they want to give their donations to a 501c3 public charity, right? Because they want the tax deduction. And they'll only get that if it goes to C3 charity. Private foundation grantors want to give the easiest type of grant for them, which is a grant to an existing 501c3 public charity. They don't want to exercise expenditure responsibility. There can be other grantors and funders that it's very important to them that their donation is treated as going to the 501c3. If we don't make sure that the sponsor has enough control over the funding, enough control over the project, really gets the funds and determines what happens next with it, the IRS might collapse the whole arrangement and treat grants and donations as going directly to the project, which would result in no deduction for the donor and the private foundation violating private foundation rules. So it's important to set this up correctly from that point of view as a sort of a tax planning matter. For other reasons that are very much closer immediately to Cole and Colleen's point of view, this is assets and responsibility of the sponsor. These become assets of the sponsor. It should have responsibility and oversight. The board should have oversight of what's going on because it has actually accountability for what's happening with the project. Why don't we go to the next slide? So some of this was spearheaded in a book that probably some of you have seen. It's called Fiscal Sponsorship, 6 Ways to Do It Right, that developed different models of fiscal sponsorship. And here is briefly the different models we have. And they're driven, the definition is driven by who is actually working on the project. So if it's employees or volunteers of the sponsor doing the project, we call it a Model A direct project. If it's an independent contractor working for the sponsor, it could be a Model B. If it's a grantee of the sponsor is actually making grants to another legal entity as a grantee, that's what we call the Model C pre-approved grant relationship. There's other models. There's a Model D where the sponsor can serve as a parent in a group exemption. The newest kid on the block is the Model L, where the project can be housed in a single member LLC, where the sponsor is a single member. And there's also a model of technical assistance, Model F. Let's go to the next slide. We are going to focus here on the two most common models, which are either the one entity direct project, the Model A project, the two entities pre-approved grant project, indirect project called the Model C. So we're going to dig a little bit into both of these models. Let's go to the next slide. So Model A, one entity direct project or comprehensive are all other terms that are used to describe this. So these are the really key characteristics of a Model A, one entity fiscal sponsorship. The project is not a separate legal entity. The project is part of the 501c3 sponsor. So it belongs to the sponsor. One important repercussion is that the sponsor is fully liable for all activities of the project. This is often sort of a stopping point for people that I explain this model to, and this is why you're going to be so keen on hearing what Colleen and Cole have to say about it, because this is actually a key piece of this. The project lead, who is actually conducting the project, serves as a volunteer or employee of the sponsor. So if that person wants to get paid by operating this project, they can become an employee of the sponsor. Or maybe they're doing it free of charge and they're doing it as a volunteer. When donors and grantors give, they are making their contributions to the sponsor. The sponsor holds it in a fund dedicated to those charitable purposes. And then the sponsor directly reports these revenues and then directly incurs expenses on behalf of the project, buying supplies, entering to a lease, other, hiring other personnel, hiring independent contractors. That could all happen out of the sponsor directly. And then the sponsor may have an advisory committee. It's not unusual for the sponsor to delegate sort of direct oversight of the project to a project committee that is, helping to manage the project. Next slide. So this is visually showing you how one model A works. So we have our funding sources, private foundations, government agents, etc. They give their money to the sponsor, and then the sponsor conducts this particular project as part of the sponsor. It is just an internal part of the sponsor. Okay. Now, I think there's one more slide on this. Let's go to the next slide. So some thoughts. So what does it mean to actually set this up? How do you set up this type of sponsorship? There is a contract where the project directors enter into a contract with the sponsor to explain how all these interactions go. And the sponsors board may have already approved a fiscal sponsorship program or approves it now. And really, any sponsor, any organization might agree to take on a new project. That can already always happen. In this particular case, they're thinking of themselves as bringing in sort of outside informal projects that are aligned with the mission of the sponsor. And they just decide, let's have a formal program where we provide this type of sponsorship and support for projects and bring them into our fold. And that's what they would be doing when they approve a fiscal sponsorship program. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this next fiscal sponsorship is the other very, very common way of doing fiscal sponsorship. And it's a really important contrast to the first. So we'll explain how this one works. So in this one, we call it the two entities fiscal sponsorship or a pre-approved grant sponsorship. And the starting point in this case is that the project is conducted by a separate legal entity. So there's another legal entity that is actually conducting the project. It could be another charitable organization that's waiting for its IRS determination letter. It could be an altogether different type of nonprofit organization like a 501c4 or 501c6, or it could be a for-profit entity. For example, in the area of filmmaking and documentaries, often there can be little entities that are formed by a filmmaker that is a little for-profit entity that might be the project entity here that is getting funding for a particular documentary through a fiscal sponsorship. So that would be a separate for-profit entity that's committed to this one charitable project. So that is your project entity. And the main relationship here is that the project entity is a grantee of the sponsor. So the sponsor will be making grants to the project entities to support the project. So in this case, the project belongs to and is conducted by the project entity. The main action, in a way, of the conduct of the project is happening at this other entity, the project entity. any project personnel works for the project entity. Really different look and feel here. A lot of the action is now happening at the project entity. Let's go to the next slide. And so just teasing that out further. So contributions to support the exempt activities of the project entity first go to the sponsor. So we still have our gifts, grants, and contributions going to the sponsor. The donors, the private foundations get to make their contributions to 501c3 public charity. This is a really important next concept. The sponsor retains variance power or discretion and control over what happens next with the money. So what this means is that when donors give, let's give here an example. Let's have a project. Let's have a project that is we have a separate legal entity that does hospital and hospice work. Let's just call it the hospital charity that is doing this hospital work. But I think can we switch the slide? I think we're on the right slide. It's slide 14. Hopefully everybody's on. No, we should be on slide 14, please. Let's stay on slide 14. That's still the right slide we're on. We're talking about the variance power here. So we have a legal entity. It wants to do hospital work. It doesn't have its C3 letter yet. And donors want to give for a specific project of this new entity to bring music into hospital. So it's the music project of the hospital. Donors give to the music project. They give money to the sponsor that says, we want to support the music project. Everybody understands the plan is that the money created for the music project will be then given as a grant to the new hospital charity. But the donors can't say you have to give it to the new hospital charity. That would be earmarking. The donors have to say, we're giving it to you, sponsor, for the music project. And then the sponsor says, yes, we've already vetted this. This is a good relationship. We like this grantee. We are in fact going to give this money to the hospital charity to support the music project. So that's sort of a key legal concept here. And then the way the accounting works, if that's all done correctly, is the sponsor reports contributions in from their donors and grantors and then grants out to the project entity. The project entity reports grants in. They're going to get a specific purpose grant for this, in this case, the music project. And then they incur expenses to implement the project at the project entity level. And as a result, among other things, the project entity is liable for the project. They are liable for actually implementing this music project where they're going into hospitals and, sharing music with the patients. Let's go to the next slide. So visually, this is how you understand it, maybe another way to understand it. So we have our funding sources. They're giving the money to the sponsor. And then the sponsor turns around based on a grant request from the project. They will make grants pursuant to a written agreement to the project entity. The project entity gives reports back to the sponsor. Let's go to the next slide, a little bit more on implementation. So these are the steps, the building blocks to do this correctly. It starts before any fundraising happens, before donation starts coming into the fiscal sponsor, it starts with a written grant proposal from the project entity. And based on that proposal, the sponsor can evaluate, yep, this is a good proposal, this is a good project, it's aligned with our mission, we like the grantee, we've done the vetting we need to do, we're comfortable with it, this is a good proposal, we're going to move forward with setting this up as a sponsorship for us that will support. Ideally, typically the sponsor board would approve every project before anything else happens based on that proposal. At that point, they have what they need to enter into written agreement where the sponsor and the project entity enter into an agreement that says, yes, we like this project, we're going to start fundraising for it, and we'll intend to make grants from time to time to support the entity. Proper solicitation of funds, this is related to what I just mentioned. So then at this point, both entities typically go out and ask donors to provide support. They can ask grantors to provide support. It needs to be really clear in the solicitation that the sponsor is asking for the support, right? It's the 501c3 sponsor that gets the grants, that gets the donations. And you have to be careful when you're asking for that support to say, we are accepting it in my example here, we're accepting it for the music project. We anticipate sort of the providing funding to the project entity, but we have ultimately discretion and control as the sponsor how we are going to use this money in our music fund and how we're going to expend it in the music project. So again, there has to be that legal discretion built in where the solicitation is for the music project, not for the ultimate project entity, because that's how we avoid earmarking and the donors get to treat their donations as actually going to the sponsor. Proper accounting of funds, if that's all correctly done, we have the accounting where the donations are accounted for as going to the sponsor, and then the sponsor does the grant to the project entity. Importantly, then reports come from the project entity on use of funds back to the sponsor. Of course, those reports need to have the right information to be able for the sponsor then to report back to any of its grantors. And typically the project entity and the sponsor work carefully together to make sure that they can provide the required reports to the original donors and grantors that funded the project. Next slide. So just a little bit on the legal agreement, the written agreement that's put into place here to solidify all these terms. This is one here. These are some of the key terms for a direct project. So a Model A, where it's an internal project, right? In this case, the agreement is between the sponsor and the project leaders. Again, there's no legal entity on the other side to enter into the contract. So the contract is entered into by the sponsor and the project leaders. I say group, there can be some a little bit nuances there about how to think about who that contracting party is, but basically it's the project leaders that enter into the agreement. The agreement will confirm that the donated assets that are going to come in will be held by the sponsor on behalf of the project. The agreement should address how personnel will be handled. Will the people be working be at-will employees of the sponsor? There can be references to sponsor policies and procedures on things like accounting, reports, disbursements, contract signing with vendors, insurance, a lot of other important pieces of the expectations around that. Important to address how solicitations for donations and grants will be coordinated. The sponsor needs to be careful that the project leaders don't just kind of go off and start fundraising with lack of clarity on the role of the sponsor. So everybody needs to work carefully together so the messaging is correct. There can be some governance provisions about the roles of the project leaders. There can be addressed the idea of a project committee that has oversight over the project. There can be guidance on lobbying because 501c3s can only do insubstantial lobbying. So that should be addressed. Obviously, any sponsor fees and other expenses that they're going to charge the project. And also very importantly, provision on termination and potential spin out of the project to a successor charity. Really good to anticipate right from the start that at some point the project might want to spin out into a separate legal entity. And then next slide, we have just a little bit of a different approach. This will again emphasize the difference. So this is sort of key terms in a pre-approved grant relationship, the Model C. In this case, the sponsor is confirming it is going to accept the donations, hold it in a restricted fund, and make grants to the project entity from time to time. That is really the main role of the fiscal sponsor. Accept the donations, account for them, make grants to the project entity. They'll make them as a specific purpose grant to the project entity because the project entity is not yet or is never going to be a 501c3. So the grant agreement has to address very specific purposes that will be implemented with the money. obviously we'll get reports back from the project entity accounting for that. There's again addressing how solicitations for donations and grants will be coordinated, guidance on lobbying so that everybody's complying with their lobbying limits. Sponsor administrative fees, again, should be addressed. What will be taken out of the grant before it gets re-granted for the sponsor's overhead. And then here also termination, potential transfer of the balance of assets to a successor charity that can occur. And I think that gets us to, if you go to the next slide. Yes, I think with that, that's sort of our overview, my overview so far of sort of how fiscal sponsorship works, the two basic models. And with that, I think Colleen and Cole want to start giving their perspective.
Yeah, before we jump into the insurance, there are some very specific questions having to do with your part of the presentation, Ingrid. So maybe a few minutes on these before we start into the insurance, just for continuity of the question being asked. Can fiscal sponsorship be used for a founding fundraiser for startup costs of a new nonprofit and their founding programs?
Yes. It can be used for that. And yeah, it just needs to define, it can't be a general purpose grant. So if you think of sort of general operational and startup costs, maybe that's where part of the question comes up, like what is the project? So you just have to be a little careful how you define those specific purpose grants if it's a Model C where you're granting to the new entity, which I think is the idea here.
Great. And then the next one is within Model A, you've described the project as belonging to the fiscal sponsor. What happens to the project's intellectual properties when and if the project decides to spin off as its own independent 501c3?
So great question. So yes, in the phase in a Model A, the intellectual property belongs to the fiscal sponsor. And you'll remember when we talked about the agreement, it should address a spin out situation. If there is a spin out where the project wants to spin out in a separate legal entity, all the assets held by the sponsor on behalf of the project, and that would include the intellectual property that's been developed, would transfer to the new entity as part of the spin out. And so to be reassuring about that, that's why it's really nice to have that addressed in the fiscal sponsorship agreement.
Yeah. And then this may have been answered when you were talking about Model C, but thanks for differentiating between fiscal sponsorship and fiscal agency. When would a fiscal agency make sense and what would it look like?
So in a fiscal agency, a little bit the idea is there's a grantor that's making a first, distribution to the sponsor, or let's say in this case, the agent, that pretty much without any discretion is on behalf of the ultimate project entity, just transferring the money on to the project entity. And I think that might be driven by the needs of the grantor, maybe that for some reason, it's easier to make that first distribution. Maybe it's a government entity and it's easier for them to make the very first distribution to the sponsor entity. It's not, but they understand the sponsor entity isn't doing discretion and control, and for accounting purposes, it might even show up still as a direct distribution to the ultimate project entity, but just for some other mechanical or administrative purposes, it could be easier for that first recipient to be that agent. That would be one example. There's probably some other examples if I thought about it. It's a very narrow scenario. It's almost never going to be a really great idea, but there could be some narrow cases where it somehow makes sense.
Yeah, and then another one, if our nonprofit fiscally sponsors another group, all the missions and basics apply to support their project, can both our groups apply for the same grant? We're both in a small community and have interest and eligibility to these same exact funding sources. We're concerned we can't apply for our other usual funding if we fiscally sponsor this group.
So it's unclear from the terminology if the group is a separate legal entity or not. So that's always the starting point. If the group is not a separate legal entity, that group can actually not directly apply for funding because the funder needs a legal entity that they can write the check to. So if it's an informal group, they will have to let the fiscal sponsor apply. If these are two legal entities that both could apply theoretically, I think it depends. I mean, if the legal entity that's running the project qualifies for a direct grant, I mean, in theory, they could apply directly to the funder. The reason they would rather might want to work with the fiscal sponsor is because the fiscal sponsor has the 501c3 designation. So if the if the funder only wants to give to a 501c3, it has to be the fiscal sponsor that applies. But
Which
of course,
they
the
couldn't
two
apply
can
for the
cooperate.
same grant then, right?
Well, it is sort of the same grant. I mean,
Yeah.
I think what they're really saying is the fiscal sponsor applies for the grant, but the fiscal sponsorship agreement has been signed. Everybody understands that the plan is that the fiscal sponsor will receive the grant money and then re-grant it to the project.
Great.
Hope that makes sense.
I'd just like to maybe add something to that. I think what that question was, let's just say project A wants funding from the same source that their fiscal sponsor is also wanting to be funded by. So since the funding comes through the fiscal sponsor, how do both of them receive grants? How do both of them receive monies from?
Oh, like if the fiscal sponsor also wants money for a wholly different project. Oh, well, I would think that with careful coordination, there would almost be two grant applications. I would think the fiscal sponsor would do an application for whatever other unrelated funding it's trying to get from the funder. And then in very close coordination with the project, they'll do essentially a joint grant application to the funder for the project's
Specific.
funding.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so there are still a lot more questions flowing in, but I think we should move into the insurance.
Let's you. I know some of you're going to cover actually a lot more new ground for people that already do this stuff. This is going to be the fun stuff because Colleen and Cole have some whole other things that only insurance people know how to catch issues on. So.
Yeah, and so just a little on my background is I worked on the carrier side, so I did a lot of underwriting of fiscal sponsors and their projects, and that's where a lot of insurance carriers and brokers don't understand what fiscal sponsors do. And so they may not be getting you exactly the coverage that you need. One of the things that we've both, Cole and I, have worked with lots of sponsors and accidental sponsors. And why I'm saying accidental sponsors is what I've come in contact with in various places in the nonprofit community is organizations, 501c3s that are actually acting as a sponsor organization without a formal agreement or without a formal setup, which could lead to some, depending on who your insurance carrier is, some real serious issues with insurance coverage. So Cole, I'm going to let you start off with this slide and the next one, and then we'll keep talking about this.
Thank you, Colleen. So the types of projects that you should be considering taking on are really those that kind of align with your mission, which makes sense, kind of what Ingrid said, and that project leaders understand their responsibilities and get liabilities that can be appropriately managed. That's a really big deal because one of the things that Ingrid said is that if you become a fiscal sponsor, you become liable for that project. That's a huge thing for your organization. So you're going to need to understand what that means. Like, what are their exposures? What are the things that you could be sued for if that project does something wrong and they get sued? So next slide. So here's the kinds of insurance policies that are available that are most common. So under the direct model, which is model A, you'd have general liability, which is essentially just bodily injury or property damage to a third party. Those would be events that you may hold in the community or any kind of services you're providing to people in the community. That's what general liability would be. And then directors and officers liability is essentially liability for board governance, That policy can include things like employment practices liability, which would include coverage in case an employee was to, be terminated and then retaliate and sue for things like wrongful termination, discrimination, harassment, things like that. That kind of policy can also cover something called fiduciary liability. So you act as a fiduciary on behalf of employees when you place benefits for them. As a Model A sponsor, you are basically all those employees of that project become, you become their employer of record. So essentially they would be eligible for all your benefits. So that's why you really need to understand that piece. The professional liability is really one of the most scary things from our standpoint, because a lot of organizations out there that are 501c3s have a certain type of professional liability called social service professional or human services professional liability. And they basically provide professional liability for that kind of exposure, for human services or social services. There's other types of professional liability, which could be like Ingrid's role. She's an attorney. That's a separate type of professional liability, or professional liability for doing services that are outside the human services or social services realm. So they could be things like media liability. So if they're doing filming or anything like that, or they're doing medical services. We had a fiscal sponsor that was asked to be added, a project that was asked to be added to a fiscal sponsor where it was like a Native American healing organization. And so that's truly a medical malpractice type exposure that's not covered by a normal social service professional liability. So it's really, really important to understand what the exposure is of these projects, because when you set up an insurance policy, you have to find an insurance company that would be willing to take this on. So you have to basically disclose all that. Generally, the insurance companies are going to want you to fill out an application for each project, and they're going to want to see a copy of that MOU or agreement that shows that you're going to be a Model A fiscal sponsor for that project. So they have to understand what their legal liability is for that project. So workers' compensation would also come into play, again, because you'd be the employer of record. So all the injuries of those people that work for that project would be your injuries under your policy. And then accident coverage is usually recommended for volunteers. So generally speaking, workers' compensation does not normally extend to volunteers. They can be added to the policy, but we normally recommend that a separate accident policy be put in place. So just in our working with Model A projects and sponsors that work with them, it's really, really important to really have a broker that understands this stuff. So that as you're taking on or considering taking on new projects, if you're not sure it's going to really qualify as a project that could be added to your policy, it's really good to run that by your insurance broker and have the underwriters at the insurance company review what this project is going to be doing to see if it's something that could be taken on. Because there could be a possibility you set this whole agreement up, they sign it, they become your project, and then the insurance company rejects them as a potential project to add. So that's a big problem for you, because then you're already liable for their legal liabilities that come up, and you'd have to find insurance coverage elsewhere. Model C kind of arrangements, you're not considered the employer of record, you're not taking on their legal liability. But we still recommend that you maybe request that they provide proof of things like general liability and then directors and officers liability. So next slide. Yeah,
I was going to say the directors and officers still have a responsibility from a governance standpoint of approving the projects as they're taken on. So, and knowing those impacts. So good governance would suggest that you make sure your board members know what the impacts of taking on the role of a sponsor is, even in an informal arrangement. And another comment that you made, Cole, about the insurance company not wanting to add the project, they may, depending on the carrier, completely non-renew your insurance based on a project that you take on. So it is important that you recognize and understand the impacts of what those operations are going to be that the project is taking.
And I would say too, the ones that are most problematic are the ones that are social justice groups. So many times what will happen is if you really want to add this project, the insurance company underwriter may say, sure, we'll add it, but we're going to take off coverage for personal injury liability or some sort of products liability or something like that, that would affect all the projects on that policy, because they're not going to just do it for that one. Some other policy features you might want to consider, and there's two, is things like abuse and molestation liability. So if the project is working with a vulnerable population, there's also an exposure for that. So next slide. So Colleen, you're going to take this one.
Yeah, so really kind of further to what we were just saying is that fiscal sponsorship does impact your insurance because they can't obtain insurance in their own name. If they're a separate legal entity and they can have insurance in their own name, then a best practice would be, well, first of all, they wouldn't be under the direct model then, but the practice would be that they would name your sponsor, the sponsor, as an additional insured to their policy if at all possible. But you would also include in your contract agreement where the liabilities lay and who's responsible for what. Any project personnel that are employees that are paid have to be covered under the workers' comp of the project sponsor. So if they are paid, if they're taking a salary out of those donations or whatever, or the grant, however that's working, they are paid and they are not a separate legal entity. They are employees and need to be covered under your workers' compensation policy. And then those volunteers of your project are also volunteers of your sponsoring organization. So you need to ensure that any practices you have for screening or for covering them under accident insurance or making sure what they're doing is safe, that all of those procedures are followed by all of the projects. And then board decisions, it can impact both your directors and officers and employment practices. You know, there's, you know, any decision the board makes can make them liable for somebody being unhappy and filing a claim against them. So, you know, at the beginning of COVID, we saw claims for shutting down, and we saw claims because they didn't shut down. So it's like, sometimes it's like, you know, but if you have a sound basis for your reasonings, you can support them. But risk management is super important. You have to understand the risks that you have, and you have to have a methodology for training your projects or teaching your projects about what those what risks they should be keeping, you know, an eye out. When we talk about general risk management, which is a whole nother hour-long thing that plus that we could talk about, when we talk about risk management, we're talking about, you know, understanding what risks that you have, and then how do you protect the organization so that the organization can stay sustainable, can stay in, you know, stay doing the good work that they're doing. But first you have to understand, and it always takes, like, you know, involve as many brains as possible is what I like to say, because, you know, what I see as being of a higher risk, you may not see as being a higher risk. And so it takes that kind of practice and discussion to come to what that needs to be. But if you don't understand what all your projects are doing as a sponsor, you are opening yourself up to a lot of potential not even being able to get insurance, as Cole said, and B, you know, a claim that you aren't prepared for. And as a sponsor, your reputation is on the line. So that's another big, you know, risk that you have, is your reputation as a sponsor.
I'd like to say too, Colleen, that having that communication between the sponsor and the project is really critical. So any new things that project wants to take on, any new programs, anything, that all has to be run through the sponsor, because they may need to clear those kind of things with the underwriters at the insurance company before they would take those on. There may be exclusions on the policy that you're not, you know, as a project isn't aware of. So having that clear communication is really, really, really essential. One other point that I want to just bring up too is that, yeah, we talk about how volunteers and employees would be protected by these policies of the sponsor, but independent contractors aren't. So a lot of times what we see that a lot of organizations try to do is to avoid things like payroll tax and all that kind of thing. They may just have people work for them as independent contractors. The problem with that is that those people are not going to be, they won't have insurance extend to them normally by any of the policies. So all those people that are working as independent contractors would be on their own. If there was a lawsuit that came up, the entity, the project or the sponsor would most likely be covered, but that individual that's working as an independent contractor would not. So they'd have to have their own cost of defense, their own damages, to be able to pay for that on their own. They wouldn't have any protection from the project or the sponsor. So that's really, really a critical piece. There are some insurance companies that may add independent contractors to certain lines of coverage. There's some workers' comp laws that, affect certain types of independent contractors that could automatically be picked up by workers' comp, but you need to really make sure to understand how that falls in with your project.
Next slide. As I said this already, most insurance carrier underwriters do not understand what it means to be a fiscal sponsor or a project. And so we do a lot of teaching and explaining. And then when we get an underwriter, often they change, and then we're doing it all over again. So I would say it is important that your broker understand this also, because they're the ones selling you to the insurance company, and you wouldn't want to find out that something isn't covered because it wasn't thoroughly disclosed. Some carriers, one of the largest insurance carriers for nonprofits, has a specific exclusion on all lines, their D&O, their GL, their professional, that excludes projects unless they've been specifically declared each year with a separate application. That isn't true of all companies, but this is one of the most common companies we see insuring nonprofits. And so we actually added a disclaimer to all of our proposals for this very reason. You need to disclose your projects. And if you don't have a written agreement, most of the carriers are going to require that you have a written agreement and see a copy of it. You should get that put into place. I said this already, sponsors really, really need to understand the operations of the project to ensure that they do have the adequate coverage. Even among nonprofits in general, like I was talking to a nonprofit recently, they're doing podcasting. They had bought an insurance policy they thought was covering their general liability. A, they're working with children, and B, they're broadcasting and have a media liability. They have what's called a business owner policy. It's a BOP policy. It basically covers like an office, and it is not covering any of those exposures that they have. And they're looking for cheaper insurance. And the fact of the matter is they can't get cheaper insurance because they're already paying the cheapest price possible, but they're not getting the coverage that they need for their most important exposures that they have, which happen to be media liability for the podcasting and publishing that they're doing, broadcasting, and their exposure with working with children. So you really need to understand those operations. Next slide.
Let me maybe just chime in here, because usually when a sponsor who's thinking about being a sponsor of projects has heard some of this, they say, oh, wow, this is really too complicated. I am not going to do direct sponsorship. I don't want to take on all the liability. Let's just do a Model C, make the project set up its own legal entity and say, okay, we're just going to do Model C. On some level, that does help with these liability issues, as Colleen and Cole have explained. The thing to be really careful about when you're encouraging projects to go that route is the project needs to be ready to run its own separate legal entity. It needs to hire its own employees. It has responsibility for its own employees. It has to figure out its insurance needs. It has to do all the administrative work that it's maybe not quite ready to do. It has to worry about its tax status. It probably needs to then immediately apply for tax exemption if that's the type of legal entity it is. So if you have an informal project that is looking for sponsorship, yes, a Model C is an easier relationship to establish for the sponsor to avoid all these issues that Colleen and Cole have talked about, but that puts a lot of pressure on the project with this new legal entity to really get up and running immediately in a lot of aspects. And so what I find so helpful about this, it's a little scary for me as not an insurance person to hear Colleen and Cole, but on the other hand, it also, I think, gives sponsors the tools to say, okay, good, if we want to do this, we want to be this kind of resource for the community, we'll just kind of go for it. We'll wrestle with this and get the insurance and the advice we need to really feel comfortable that we can play this sponsorship role.
And ask lots of questions. I mean,
Right.
I think that ask questions of both whoever's advising you on your agreements and your insurance broker. You know, a lot of I realize and understand and acknowledge that a lot of people do not understand the role of the insurance broker in the process. And having worked on all sides of the insurance industry, you know, you as the nonprofit, as the project, as the sponsor, you know. Most of the insurance companies that are going to write your coverages won't work with you directly. They go through a broker. They go through a broker, to help explain the coverages to you, but also as a broker, we are your advocate and your voice to multiple underwriters and companies. We don't write with insurance with one company because not one company can insure everybody. And that's really the role of your broker. There are insurance issues if a project is spinning out, and it's similar to what Ingrid was just saying, where parts are conducted by the sponsor, parts are conducted by a separate legal entity. Usually you spell those out contractually, and you would have the legal side of that spelling out who's responsible for what and where it's going. Projects, I've seen projects managed by a fiscal sponsor indefinitely. They don't want to spin out and they want to remain as when I was working on the carrier side as an underwriter, there was a camp. It ran once a year. It was like a yearly event type of a thing. They never wanted to set up a year-round infrastructure, a year-round project. They stayed a fiscally sponsored project for 10, 15 years, maybe even more than that. And others may spin up into a fully fledged standalone nonprofit. And I think I've seen it all over the board. What about you, Ingrid?
I totally agree. All over the board. What do we have? We have 5 more minutes. Should we do some questions?
Yeah, we need to do some questions.
I know.
Yeah.
Let's get to the Q&A.
Okay, I can read some questions out to you. Let's see. This Model C would include an arts collective as the project entity who used to have 501(c) status and gets a grant from a completely separate foundation. They ask a larger 501(c)(3) to be their fiscal sponsor. That sounded like a statement, but it was a question. Okay.
I agree. That sounds like that could work. Yeah.
Okay. This came after we were talking about applying for the same grant. It says, does that work the same for federal funding, Model C? That's just the way the question is.
I think it really depends on the terms of the federal funder. I think what's really important, and I know just enough about government grants to be dangerous, is the requirements tend to flow through. So if one entity gets a federal grant and they re-grant to another, and maybe there's another, you just have to really pay attention to how the federal grant requirements flow down through whatever the ultimate project is. All the accounting, all the very special audit requirements, accounting requirements, reporting, they will tend to flow down in my understanding. But certainly I have seen, and I do think fiscal sponsors can help a lot, essentially provide all the technical advice and infrastructure to make the whole thing work. So yes, it could work, but you have to be really careful about how the requirements flow down.
Colleen, we also have some questions around funds. Do project funds need to be held separately from the sponsor's general funds?
They you might have other answers. So they need to be legally separately accounted for because they're restricted funds. So they need to be on the books held separately. I have heard that some fiscal sponsors, just as a best easier practice like to open a separate bank account for each project just to make it easier to track. So one or the other can work.
Great. And we have just a couple minutes left. So let's ask one more question here. If an existing program of a parent nonprofit wants to spin off and become its own 501c3, would a fiscal sponsorship with that parent nonprofit be an option for the short term?
This is a little bit like Colleen's, like sometimes you almost fall into fiscal sponsorship without really thinking of it that way. But yeah, I think you could have a spin-off where the new entity is being established and the parent entity might start transferring assets over, funding over, while the new entity is still getting up to speed. I will say that for an existing fiscal sponsor that's doing a lot of spin-outs, they often have a requirement that they're not going to fully spin out the project and transfer the assets until the new project has its 501c3 letter. So for that type of spin out of an existing fiscal sponsor, likely that won't happen until you have your IRS letter.
Well, we've just about reached our time today, and we've been able to answer a multitude of questions, but there are still some in the Q&A box. So what I will do is compile these questions into a Word document. We'll write answers for those, and we'll include that Word document with the webinar recording as well as the slides. Cole, do you have anything to add?
Oh, no, just thanks for letting us be here today.
Yeah,
We're
lots of
pleased that you
questions.
all could join us. So once again, thanks so much to Cole, Ingrid, and Colleen for joining us. I know we covered a lot of information today, and that this subject can be particularly tricky and cumbersome. So please do feel free to reach out to us at CalNonprofits or at CalNonprofits Insurance Services. I'll include contact information for the panelists today, as well as all of the resources that we've discussed, and we'll be sending them out to everyone who registered. Also, please feel free to share this webinar and those resources with folks that are in your community and that might be also interested or asking some of these same questions. So once again, thanks everyone for joining us. It's been a quick hour, and I really appreciate everyone's attention. And thanks again to our speakers for making this a particularly informative and educational webinar. Hope everyone has a great rest of their afternoon and look forward to being in touch at our next CalNonprofits webinar. Thanks so much.